Hello, you fucks. Welcome to John Solo's Beer Brigade. I'm John Solo. You are not. But just make sure. Like, if you feel a little like John Solo for a second, and you're like, I'm not sure he's right, just make sure. There's a couple tests you can do. First, just tug on your beard a little bit. Just tug. Make sure it's real. It's there. Sometimes it could fool you. If it starts coming out, either that's a fake beard or you need to go to the hospital. Second, you can just kind of rub the top of your head a little bit. Just rub it a little bit. Just see how smooth it is. If it's completely smooth, you might be John Solo. And third, if every time you say the wrong word, a woman gets in your ear and says, "Stop," you might be John Solo. So, anyways, we are working today on, well, it's a little Kiki Clark, the name that's fun to wear on your face, in your mouth. I'm not sure exactly which one that is, but we love Kiki to death. The book we're working on today is a continuation in the Leather and Chrome series. This is book 3. Here's the cover here so you can get a good look at it. And it looks like it's going to be coming out, I don't know, we're working on it. Today is Monday, June 6th. I bet you this is going to be out by the weekend in Audible. We shall see, though. I'm not in control of these things. So, I'm going to flip this back. I'm going to read you the blurb here real quick. Ride hard, love harder, yearn for larger cocks. Houston has a secret, one that he hasn't even shared with his motorcycle club, one that involves ropes and dominance and pretty little subs kneeling at his feet. And he's fine with that, prefers it really. It keeps his life nice and orderly. But the night Kenneth dropped into his life changed everything. Entranced, he watched the sweet nurse stitch up one of his brothers and then slip away. Even after he's gone, his shy eyes, full of desperate yearning, continue to haunt him. Houston has an idea of what the boy needs, and he thinks he's just the dom to give it to him. Besides, what good is a carefully compartmentalized life when he could have Kenneth instead? Yearning is the third book in the Leather and Chrome series, but can be enjoyed on its own. The story features a missed connection made right, an age gap, nosy friends with the best of intentions, a possessive biker with a huge cock, and golden brown skin wrapped in teal rope. So, that's the blurb. Now, I've actually done this Storytime twice. And the reason being was because I did the first one, it was pretty good. But then I ran into, we like to call it in the industry the meet cute scene. That's where the two characters meet, and it's always a cute, comical kind of thing. But there's also the meet fuck scene, and that's where the two characters, they for the first, so whenever possible, I like to share the meet fuck scene with you because I know you all like that. So this is going to be chapter 6. There's really no spoilers other than the fact that I've already warned you that there's going to be some smexy times going on, but you check it out. Let me know what you think. Obviously leave comments and all that fun shit, and I will see you the next time around. Have fun. 6. "Oh, God," Kenneth whispered, his eyes immediately going to the hulking figure leaning against a motorcycle outside his apartment building as he turned into the parking lot. He was almost 45 minutes later than he had told Houston, and he'd convinced himself the man wouldn't still be there. He'd texted Kenneth about half an hour before, asking if everything was okay, and when Kenneth had just said, "Emergency at work. Not sure how much longer." I need to get that voice again. He's a very high Tuvok and very nervous, very unsure of himself. When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air. I don't know why that is so hard for me to move into that register with that voice. If everything was okay. And when Kenneth had just said, "Emergency at work. Not sure how much longer I'll be," Houston hadn't responded. The radio silence had been crushing when Kenneth had realized he hadn't heard back once he was work. Not sure how much longer I'll be. Houston hadn't responded. The radio silence had been crushing when Kenneth realized he hadn't heard back once he was walking to his car. I'm parsing that wrong. Work. Not sure how much longer I'll be. Houston hadn't responded. The radio silence had been crushing when Kenneth had realized he hadn't heard back once he was walking to his car, the weight stacking on top of the heaviness of what had happened at the end of his shift. He'd been so nervous about inviting Houston over for dinner, taking a whole week to work up the courage, so the idea that he'd messed everything up already had brought tears to his eyes. The sight of Houston's large form was exciting and terrifying all at once. Had he only stuck around to yell at Kenneth for wasting his time? That was something Tim would have done, especially toward the end, where it had seemed like nothing he'd done had been good enough. Would Houston be like that too? God, he hoped not. He really should have pressed CJ for permission. Would Houston be like that too? God, he hoped not. He really should have pressed CJ for more information about the man during their breakfast, but he'd been too worried that CJ wouldn't like the idea of Kenneth crushing on one of the MC members, and it would strain their fragile new relationship. After the way his shift had ended...
Stop. A fragile new friendship.
Yeah, whatever. They're in a relationship, too. They all are. It's a freaking cultish MC club. Too worried that CJ wouldn't like the idea of Kenneth crushing on one of the MC members, and it would strain their fragile new friendship. After the way his shift had ended, Kenneth was about 3 seconds away from curling in a ball and crying himself to sleep for the weekend. There was no way he could handle Houston being pissed at him, too. As he pulled into his designated parking spot, he kept an eye on Houston in his rearview mirror, watching as he straightened up and studied Kenneth's car. It was dark, so he probably hadn't seen who was driving it. He took a deep breath, then opened his door. As soon as he was outside his car, he felt his fingers beginning to tremble, but he forced himself to turn and face Houston. "Hi." The parking lot was too dark to make out Houston's face, but he raised a hand. "Well, hello there." He reached into the compartment at the back of his motorcycle and withdrew a package, heading toward Kenneth without hesitation. The scent of fried food hit Kenneth, and his stomach growled loudly. Houston chuckled. "I don't know how good anything will be reheated, but if it's edible..." And his stomach growled loudly. Houston chuckled. "I don't know how good anything will be reheated, but if it's inedible, we can... If it's inedible..." And his stomach growled loudly. Houston chuckled. "I don't know how good anything will be reheated, but if it's inedible, we can order a pizza." Kenneth sucked in a breath, tilting his head back to meet Houston's eyes as he just kept coming until he was less than a foot away. "I didn't think you'd still be here." Head cocked, Houston studied him in the dim light until Kenneth dropped his gaze to Houston's leather-clad chest. "Let's go inside, gorgeous." Kenneth shivered and nodded, turning and leading him. Clad. Gorgeous. Kenneth shivered and nodded, turning and leading them into his building. The sound of music was loud in the hallway, but Kenneth was used to it and just ignored it as he headed up the metal steps to the second floor. Most of the people who lived in the apartment complex, which was nicer and more expensive than ones that were closer to the university, were upperclassmen and grad students. So he'd had to get used to loud music, raised voices, and the smell of pot in the air pretty quickly. Houston didn't say anything as he followed him up the steps and down the upper hallway to his apartment, and he still didn't say anything as Kenneth unlocked the door and pushed inside, flipping on a light so they could see. The place wasn't much. The living room and kitchen basically one space, and his bedroom and bathroom just beyond, creating a small square apartment that matched everyone else's in the building. But he'd done his best to make it nice, adding pictures to the walls and lots of fluffy blankets to the furniture in the living room. It felt cozy and welcoming to him, especially after a long day, though he couldn't help but wonder how Houston viewed it. It felt cozy and welcoming to him, especially after a long day, though he couldn't help but wonder how Houston viewed it. When the silence became too much, he turned and offered a tentative smile to the man. "You can hang your... how about hang up?" When the silence became too much, he turned and offered a tentative smile to the man. "You can hang up your jacket there." Houston looked where he was pointing and nodded, setting the bundle of food on the arm of his couch before unzipping his leather jacket and hanging it up. He was wearing another V-neck underneath, this one a rich red that flattered his dark skin. Though Kenneth wasn't sure there was anything the man wouldn't look good in. Feeling overwhelmed and jittery, Kenneth took off his own coat and hung it up, then glanced down at his scrubs. The last couple of hours hit him all over again, and he sucked in a shaky breath. I should shower. Make yourself comfortable?" "Kenneth." "I'll just be a minute," he said, ignoring the frown on Houston's face and turning toward his bedroom. He felt fragile, or fragile. he said, ignoring the frown on Houston's face and turning toward his bedroom. He felt fragile, like his whole body was full of cracks that were seconds away from shattering, and Houston leaving him alone with his thoughts would be the tap on the glass he needed to crumble. The echo of a heart monitor flatlining was ringing in his ears, and even though he doubted he was fit for company, he was prepared to beg to get Houston to stay. "Stop." The word was firm, but not loud, and Kenneth's feet froze in place. "Turn around, please." Firm, but not. Kenneth's feet froze in place. "Turn around, please." It was obvious the please was an afterthought, but Kenneth supposed he appreciated the effort, even as he turned, keeping his face down to hide his wet eyes. Scuffed black boots came into his view right before a large, warm hand cupped the side of his neck. Kenneth sucked in a breath, realizing how cold he'd been as the heat from Houston's palm soaked into his skin. "Lift your eyes, sweetheart," Houston said, voice little more than a rumble. Heart racing, Kenneth tilted his face up, meeting Houston's gaze. There was a deep furrow between his dark brows as he studied Kenneth, and Kenneth had the strangest urge to reach up and smooth it. He didn't, though, not sure if his touch would be welcome. "Talk to me. Are you just nervous that I'm here? Or is it whatever happened with your emergency?" The tears Kenneth had just barely been holding back filled his eyes again, and he tried to look away to hide them, but Houston's other hand came up, both of them clasping the sides of his face to hold him still. "Don't hide from me, Kenneth." Tears spilling from his lashes, he stared into Houston's dark, intense eyes. "I'm sorry." Houston made a sort of growling noise. "Don't be sorry, sweet boy. Just tell me what's wrong so I can fix it." His heart breaking all over again, he squeezed his eyes shut. "You can't fix it. He died." His heart breaking all over again, he squeezed his eyes shut. You can't fix it. He died. He was only 6 and strong arms pulled. He died. He was only 6 and strong arms pulled him into a wide chest and wrapped around him as he sobbed. Now that the dam had burst, he couldn't hold back as he clutched at Houston. He didn't realize he was gasping out words, still trying to explain how smart little Justin had been, or what a fighter he was, and how they had all thought he'd pull through, until Houston gently shushed him. "Shh. It's okay, I've got you. So does my stomach. My big black belly. Shh. It's okay, I've got you. Take a deep breath, sweetheart. I know it hurts. But you're okay." God, did it hurt. It always did. He tried for years to find that professional distance his colleagues talked about, but he couldn't do it. So when he'd moved to Ridgewood and started at the hospital, it could be that Purple and Zhivka are the same person. Have you ever seen them in the room at the same time together? It's like Fred Savage
Yes.
and... I don't know. I'm not sure. Find that professional distance his colleagues talked about, but he couldn't do it. So when he'd moved to Ridgewood and started at the hospital there, he decided to stop trying and just accept that it was who he was. Every single patient was precious to him, and he fought for and loved them even though he died a little each time he lost one of them. Even though he died a little each time he lost one of them. He cried for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. And when he started to slow, he was hollow inside. But there was also space, so he could finally take a deep breath. The ache of Justin's death would stay with him for a long time, but he was no longer being crushed under the weight. And that was thanks to Houston. He knew he should probably be embarrassed about getting the man soaking wet with tears and snot, but he was too tired to get worked up about it. All he wanted to do was go to sleep, but he also didn't want to let Houston go. It had been so long since he had been comforted instead of being the one offering the comfort. When Houston's arms loosened a little, Kenneth made a soft noise of protest and held on tighter, deciding he could be humiliated by his neediness in the morning. "It's okay," Houston said, his chest rumbling under Kenneth's face where he was burrowed. "Don't leave, please," Kenneth whispered thickly. He shivered when Houston slid a hand up to clasp the back of his neck and pressed what felt like a kiss into Kenneth's hair. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to lock the door and put the food in the fridge. Then I'm going to take care of you." Take care of him? Kenneth wasn't sure what that would entail, but it sounded really good to him, like really good. Like Houston was offering Kenneth the one thing he had always wanted but never gotten. Cock. Houston was offering Kenneth the one thing he had always wanted but never gotten. He reminded himself that Houston wasn't making any promises, that they hadn't even gone on a date yet, for pity's sake, and that he'd end up devastated if he wasn't careful to protect his heart. For the first time in a long time, though, he wanted to be a little reckless, even if it was just for one night. He'd take all the soft words and comforting touches and hoard them away for when Houston left him. It almost felt inevitable, like because his mom had died and his dad had left him behind when he'd taken Kenneth's siblings away, that no one would ever really stay, that he wasn't worth staying for. And if that was the case, then he'd at least have the memory of his time with Houston to ease the ache inside him. It took him a few minutes to loosen his hold, but Houston didn't seem like he was in a rush, gently running his free hand up and down Kenneth's back in a soft caress. Taking one final deep breath, Kenneth let go and stepped back, swiping at his face. He shivered as Houston pulled away, his fingers sliding over the bare skin at the nape of his neck. Just like he said, Houston walked over and locked the door, toeing off his boots and leaving them under his jacket before grabbing the food from the couch and heading into the kitchen. He just shoved the whole thing onto one, leaving them and heading into the kitchen. He just shoved the whole thing onto one nearly bare shelf in Kenneth's refrigerator and then closed the door and came back over to where he was still standing, having not moved. "Thank you for waiting for me," Houston said softly. Kenneth jolted. It literally hadn't occurred to him to do anything else, but he still mumbled, "You're welcome." He peeked a look up at Houston's face and found him smiling in a gentle way that made goosebumps race down his arms. His dark brown eyes were nearly black, but there was so much warmth in them, heating Kenneth from the inside out. "I need you to do something for me," Houston said, snagging one of Kenneth's hands and raising it to his face to press a light kiss to his palm and making him shiver. "Okay," Kenneth croaked, wishing he could feel those lips in many, many other places on his body. "You want me to take care of you, right, Kenneth?" He was surprised at the question. How could Houston doubt that was what he wanted? He'd just snotted all over the man's shirt. Or was he looking for some sort of out now that he'd gotten a glimpse of just how needy Kenneth really was? Not sure what the right answer was, he bit into his lip before saying, "I understand if you can't stay." Houston's eyes narrowed, and he used his hold on Kenneth's hand to jerk him forward so they were plastered against each other again. He guided Kenneth's hand up to palm the side of his bristly cheek, then wrapped both of his own arms around Kenneth's back, holding him firmly. "Don't do that. Don't pull away from me. I want nothing more than to keep holding on to you and taking care of you. But I need to be sure that's what you want." Head craned back to hold Houston's gaze. Kenneth realized he was breathing a little fast and his heart was thumping in his ears. No one had ever spoken to Kenneth like Houston did, so plainly that there was no question about what he wanted. It felt good not to play. Like Houston did, so plainly But there was no question about what he wanted. It felt good to not play games. He hadn't dated much since Tim, but in college and before Tim, most guys had been the opposite of Houston. They never wanted to let anyone know what they were really feeling, constantly holding their cards close to their chests. It had been exhausting. It was thrilling and terrifying to be so free with what he wanted, but there was no other answer that Kenneth could give. I know it's too much and too intense for a first date, but yes, that's what I want. He licked his dry lips and added on a whisper, "More than anything, Houston." Something eased in his handsome face, and he smiled, turning and pressing his upturned lips into the thin skin of Kenneth's wrist, like he could share his happiness that way. And maybe he could, because Kenneth swore his heart gave a tiny jolt. "Don't worry about things being too much. There is no right or wrong, only what works best for us. Okay?" That sounded too good to be true, and didn't align at all with what Kenneth had experienced with other men, but he found himself nodding anyway. "Okay." "Good." Houston watched him for a long moment before giving a quick nod. "All right. For tonight, if I do or say something you don't like, you simply say, 'Stop.' Understood?" The way he phrased that made Kenneth wonder if there would be nights where Houston wouldn't stop if Kenneth told him to. With anyone else, that would have scared him into changing his mind and kicking them out of his apartment, but with Houston, that would have scared him into changing his mind and kicking them out of his apartment, but with Houston, a shiver raced down his spine and his belly flipped as his mind conjured up scenarios he'd barely let himself think about, let alone wish for. Even though he hardly knew the man, he couldn't deny that he felt safe with him already. There was just something about Houston that had drawn him in from the moment he'd laid eyes on him in that bar. He also couldn't help but remember how Houston's arms had felt as he had held him while Kenneth cried, or the way he'd smiled when he'd seen Kenneth step out of his car, even though he'd been waiting almost an hour for him, or the way he'd tracked Kenneth down in the parking garage stairwell just to thank him for looking after his friend, how he'd offered to get Kenneth groceries when he'd fumbled asking him about down in the parking garage stairwell just to thank him for looking after his friend, how he'd offered to get Kenneth groceries when he'd fumbled asking him out. As far as Kenneth was concerned, the man had earned himself some leeway and was well on his way to completely gaining Kenneth's trust. The smart thing to do would be to hold back to protect himself, but why should he start being smart with his heart now? Throat thick with emotions, Kenneth whispered, "Okay." "Say it back to me." The penetrating look Houston leveled on him began to heat his body from the inside out. "If I don't like something, I say stop." "Good boy." "If I don't like something, I say stop." "If I don't like something, I say stop." "Good boy." Those two words hit Kenneth in the chest, making him go lightheaded as he sucked in a breath. "Houston." "Don't worry, sweet boy," Houston said, stepping back but grabbing Kenneth's hand once more. "Just let me take care of you for a change." Kenneth let himself be led back into his bedroom and then into his bathroom, but he couldn't help but disobey Houston, worry eating at him. Houston's assurances sounded so nice, but also like something he shouldn't get used to. For as long as he could remember, even before his mom died and left him alone with his broken father, it had been his job to make sure his siblings were dressed and fed and got to school on time. And after she passed, things had been really bad. And then just as he was getting himself and his brother and sisters back to some sort of normal, his dad packed them up and moved them to Florida, leaving Kenneth behind. He'd thrown himself into college to fill the aching hole left in their absence, and then again into his job, but it hadn't been the same. He'd still been alone, had been forced to learn to be okay being alone. Even when he'd been with Tim, he'd still felt that way. The emotional distance Tim had maintained and the sneaking around even in their own home had created a chasm between them. He craved the comfort Houston was offering, so he told himself to enjoy it while he could. It might not last, and he had a feeling that Houston could do a lot more damage than Tim had in a lot less time. But his poor battered heart needed this. Houston's gentle touch and caring eyes were going to snag Kenneth's heart in no time flat. He could just feel it, and unlike with Tim, who he'd never actually fallen for, loving and losing Houston might destroy him. That was tomorrow's problem, though. For tonight he'd let Houston offer him soft words and touches and to take the aching pain of loss away, at least a little. Then tomorrow, or next week, or next month, whenever Houston got tired of taking care of him, he'd put on his game face and remind himself he was strong enough to take care of himself. "Raise your arms," Houston said, turning to him after getting the water in the shower going. Without hesitation, Kenneth did as he was told, shivering as Houston peeled his navy blue scrub top off his torso and over his head, then reached up and straightened Kenneth's glasses for him, his fingers trailing down the sides of his face on the way back down to Houston's sides. The light in the bathroom was harsh on his serious face as he studied Kenneth's bare skin for a moment, the path his eyes taking lighting up just as clearly as if Houston had touched him with his hands. Kenneth swallowed and ducked his chin so he could watch Houston through his lashes as he reached forward and untied the drawstring on Kenneth's pants. It was a little harder to just stand there and let Houston tug his scrub bottoms and briefs down his legs, even more so when Houston knelt to help him step out of them, and his face was within inches of Kenneth's dick. Inches. Hands fisted at his sides, he felt his face flushing as his cock reacted to the close proximity of the man Kenneth had been doing his best not to daydream about, and failing more often than not, for months. He forced himself to squeeze his eyes shut so he couldn't see how close Houston was, but that only made it worse in some ways, the heat of Houston's body seeming to reach out and wrap around him just as easily as the man's arms had. Hot, moist air hit his shaft, and Kenneth couldn't help but flex his hips a little as he bit down on his lip to try and stifle his whimper. God, Houston hadn't laid a hand on him in any sort of sexual manner, and yet Kenneth was going to be fully hard in seconds. Was he that desperate? Or was his attraction to Houston just that powerful? He felt more than heard Houston stand once more, but he kept his eyes shut and tried to slow his breathing and heart rate so he didn't embarrass himself. Over the sound of the shower running, he caught the rustle of fabric and knew Houston was taking off his own clothing. A whimper escaped him as his imagination did its best to provide him with the image of a naked and aroused Houston. He ignored the tiny voice, coaxing him to open his eyes and take a peek. He wanted to. Dear God, did he want to. But if he saw that Houston wasn't as affected as Kenneth was, he wasn't sure he'd be able to stand it. Big hands cupped his face and tipped his head back. "You remember the rule for tonight?" A shudder raced down Kenneth's spine at how deep Houston's voice had gotten. "I remember." "Do you want to say stop?" He shook his head as much as he could within Houston's hold. Stopping was the last thing he wanted. Houston didn't say anything for a long moment, his thumbs brushing lightly over Kenneth's cheeks and lips, driving him to distraction, so he almost missed when Houston said, "Do I need to order you to open your eyes?" Goosebumps sprang up all down his arms at just the idea, and he almost opened his eyes without thinking, desperate to see if Houston looked as serious as he sounded. But he squeezed his lid shut once more before they could do more than flutter and offer him the tiniest glimpse of bright light and dark brown skin. "Please?" Instead of giving the order, Houston crowded into him until Kenneth's ass was pressing into the bathroom counter behind him, and still Houston kept coming. Kenneth gasped as their bodies collided, and he felt it. His hands flying up to grip at Houston's waist to steady himself. Houston's erection was big and hot against the skin above his groin and took his damn breath away. Houston's hands slid back into his hair and gripped firmly, keeping his head back so they were face to face, and soft lips brushed against the corner of his mouth. His fingers dug into Houston's skin as he held his breath, wanting a kiss from this man more than he'd wanted anything in a long time. "Open your eyes, boy." The words were said quietly, but with a firm edge that had Kenneth's dick jumping where it had been a long time. "Open your eyes, boy." The words were said quietly, but with a firm edge that had Kenneth's dick jumping where it was pressed against Houston's hip, and his eyes flying open before his brain had fully processed the command. "There he is," Houston murmured, leaning back down and running his nose and lips up the side of Kenneth's face. "Such a sweet boy." He couldn't stop the punched-up the side of Kenneth's face. "Such a sweet boy." He couldn't stop the punched-out sound from leaving his mouth or the pre-cum he felt slicking Houston's smooth skin. Houston groaned softly against the shell of his ear. "You're killing my resolve, Kenneth." Resolve for what? He couldn't help but ask, even as he gave the tiniest thrust against Houston to try and get some friction on his aching cock. One of Houston's hands shot down to grab Kenneth's hip in a tight grip. "That. There will be none of that tonight. This is about comfort and taking care of you, not orgasms." The idea that he, Kenneth Green, had the power to crumble the resolve of a man like Houston filled him with a buoyant sense of pride. Feeling braver than he had in ages, Kenneth traced the thin lines of the mandala tattooed on one of Houston's pecs, pushing out his lower lip in a pout. Is that mandala or mandala? I've never seen it before.
Mandala.
Thank you. Like Houston, filled him with a buoyant sense of pride. Feeling braver than he had in ages, Kenneth traced the thin lines of the mandala tattooed on one of Houston's pecs, pushing out his lower lip in a pout. Why can't an orgasm be part of taking care of me? I think I'd get a lot of comfort from it. A whole lot. A wide, happy smile spread across Houston's face like he loved that Kenneth was teasing him, something that he usually only did with his siblings, though not in the same flirty kind of way. No, this was new, and just something Houston brought out of him. It made Kenneth feel bolder and safe to do it again. So, he did. Slowly, he wrapped his arms around Houston, eyes roaming over the thick lines of ink on his shoulders and biceps. Over the thick lines of ink on his shoulders and biceps. He rolled his hips forward once more and bit his lip at how good it felt. His eyes fluttered, but he forced them to stay open and watched as Houston studied him, a thoughtful look on his face. "Please," Kenneth whispered, leaning forward to press a soft kiss to the edge of Houston's strong jaw. "Please, can I?" The edge of Houston's strong jaw. "Please, can I?" Usually he didn't care to beg for anything, in bed or in life, but with Houston, it was freeing in a way he'd never gotten to experience before. Arousal surged through him, lighting up his skin and making his toes and fingers tingle as he whispered please into Houston's skin, knowing it wasn't up to him whether or not he got to come. It was up to Houston. And that was something he'd always wanted. A part of him wanted Houston to say no, to deny him and assert his control, but the larger, more vocal part was dying to come. Somehow it had become the most important thing to him, and he couldn't think of anything else. When Houston's fingers tightened on his hip, slowing his movements, Kenneth whimpered against his throat. A sharp tug on his hair brought his face out from where he'd buried it, and he met Houston's heated eyes. "You're going to be more of a handful than I thought, sweet boy," Houston murmured, and Kenneth worried that was a bad thing. Had he pushed too hard? As if reading his mind, a wicked grin appeared on Houston's tempting mouth. "Don't worry. My hands are big enough for the job." Desire twisted in Kenneth's belly and drew his balls up as his cock pulsed. All he could do was stare up into Houston's face and wait to see what he'd decide to do. With Houston holding him so firmly, that was all he was allowed to do. Holding his gaze, Houston slid his hand from Kenneth's hip down to his ass and gave him a squeeze that lit his blood on fire. "You want to come?" "Please." "Then do it. Make yourself come against me." He tugged at Kenneth, forcing his hips forward to rub his aching cock against the dip between Houston's groin and thigh again. "Use my body to give yourself pleasure, sweet boy." Permission granted. There were no more thoughts or worries left inside him. Kenneth became a wild thing, his hips bucking forward over and over as his nails dug into Houston's upper back. He tried to tip his face into Houston's neck again to hide just a little, as his body unabashedly sought to take what it needed, but Houston tightened his hold in his hair to hold him still. Gazes locked, Kenneth had never felt more vulnerable or exposed as he did in that moment, and it only made him hotter. Moaning so loud it echoed in the tiny enclosed space, he wondered if he'd survive the night, or if he'd burst into flames at any moment until there was nothing but a pile of ash left. Had he truly ever thought he could protect his heart from getting too attached? As Houston's fingers tightened on his ass and in his hair, the tiny licks of pain shooting straight to Kenneth's balls, he realized how foolish he'd been. "Come on, sweet boy. You can do it. Cover my skin in your slick cum." The base guttural words were all he needed to fly over the edge. The eruption so huge and sudden, Kenneth cried out, his screams filling the bathroom. And still, he didn't look. Kenneth cried out, his screams filling the bathroom. And still, he didn't look away. Not even when he started to come down from his high, legs wobbly and arms like rubber. A look of primal satisfaction tightened Houston's jaw as he stared into Kenneth's eyes. Kenneth's poor heart was so screwed.